All right. So, welcome everyone to our game mastering advice from Kobold. Sorry, I should probably say that correctly. Kobold's Guide to Game Mastering Advice for GMs. There we go. I know how to read panel names. All right, with us today we have Shawn Merwin and Ron Korn. Shawn, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell people who you are, what you do.
I would love to do that, and I will even do it. My name is Shawn Merwin. I am a freelancer in the RPG industry. I have worked with companies such as Wizards of the Coast and Kobold Press and some others. I am also a member of the Adventurers League administration team. I am the resource manager for the Oracle of War campaign from Eberron. And I will be talking at you for 59 and a half minutes from now.
Awesome. And Ron.
Hi, I'm Ron Korn. I have a few minor credits out there. I have worked with Kobold Press, a few articles posted on the website. In addition, there's an adventure and magazine article floating around there someplace in cyberspace. Adventure a Week, as well as the original first print of the Gygax magazine. Other than that, I've just been GMing or DMing for a very, very long time, circa 1980, all the way to the present day. So welcome. Hello, everybody.
Woohoo. All right. So we got people that know game mastering. That's good. That's good for this panel. That's kind of what we need.
Hey, Meagan, who are you?
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I should probably. Yes, I am Meagan Maricle. I am one of the editors of Kobold Press, and I am your local Kobold host today.
Welcome.
All right. So what would be a good one to start us off? Let's see. Well, let's just the basics of game mastering. So like what are game masters supposed to do? Not just the running the game part, but like the whole concept of game mastering. Guess. Yeah, kind of the whole concept. Like, what are you supposed to do as a game master aside from just write the story?
Mm-hmm.
Shawn, you want to go first?
I'm going to let you go first, Ron,
okay.
if you would like.
Sure. So that's an interesting question in that it's certainly changed over time and changed with my maturity personally. When you originally sit down, the goal is I guess it winds up the same way, right? You and a couple friends get together and try to have a good time and have fun. But I remember, originally it seemed to have a DM, GM versus player mentality. It was more competitive. And again, I don't know if that just comes with maturity, but what I've found over time now is the game has developed into more of a collaborative game. It's a we game. It's certainly about socialization, getting together and have a good time, but you all share as part of the story. So the GM really, the job is, in my opinion at this point, to put in a lot of work, to craft a framework for players, to provide hooks, opportunities. He can be the arbiter, the rules guy. It doesn't always have to be. I've had players at the table who certainly were more rules focused than I was. But I think when you start out, people are hoping that you'll just provide a place, provide a sandbox to play in, and help them along the way. So I see it more as a guide and somewhat as a teacher at this point, and not necessarily as an adversary for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think that teacher point is great because a lot of skills that you use as a DM are skills that teachers need. When you sit down at the table, one of the things you need to do is engage everyone.
Yeah.
Just like if you're a teacher, you don't want to focus on, Johnny or Susie totally. You want to make sure that you are engaging all 20 some kids in your classroom. And so as the DM or the GM, you need to be able to, as you're reading box text or telling your part of the story, look around the table and make sure you're making eye contact with everyone. Using visual cues to make sure that every player understands the situation that you're explaining, understands where you are in the game. All of those tools that teachers use come into play during a DMing session. And a lot of times it's just as simple as quietly taking control of the situation, right? Quietly taking control of the table. Speak up. If you're running at a convention, you're probably DMing for 6 strangers. When they come to the table, hi, how are you? Where are you from? Just that question establishes that line of communication that you're going to use during the game, lets the players know that you know what you're doing, that you're confident enough to run them through the game. And it sets up what will actually be the play of the game, which is you say something, they say something, you say something, they say something. Yeah. And all of that just gets the game off on the right foot.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. I've seen that transformation too. In all my years of playing, what tends to get me to the table is the opportunity to teach, right? There's nothing like having a player who's never played the game or is, starts off disinterested and not my thing, and watching them blossom. And I think that's a real good point. I think that is your job as much. And the one that we don't pay attention to enough is making sure everyone at the table is involved and gets to participate and gets to have a good time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that actually was going to be my follow-up question when Shawn was talking about talking to each of the players. What are some things that you do to try and get people involved? Because, there's always that one player that's really enthusiastic and answers all the questions and we are going to go do this and we are going to go do that. And it's like, okay, you're the one person that's kind of driving the narrative. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. We definitely want the enthusiastic players. But then how do you get the players that are kind of in the background that are going, yeah, sure, I'll do that, whatever. How do you get them a little more involved and getting them to engage more in the play?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I've done, and I'll start with the easiest first, and that's paying attention to what's going on at the table, right? Watching people, watching what they interact with, watching what makes them happy, where they find their excitement at. I think it's necessary to look at their character sheets, figure out if they've put a background in there, weave that into the storyline so that they feel invested. Create the adventure and the sessions based on skill sets so that they are the most experienced person in that area. So if you find, a rogue who has the highest number in stealth, creating an opportunity for that to happen. But the easiest, I was going to say the easiest, is feedback. So I've had players at the table of all different walks, of all different life, places with gaming, and I have asked how I did, right? What did you like? What was the best part of the game? What did you find that was fascinating? Where did you feel like you had a good time? And using that feedback, which includes what I didn't do well, to form the next session. I've had players where they've come to the table with extreme anxiety, ultra shy, and knowing when they feel uncomfortable, knowing when they feel comfortable. But I've also seen those same players, when role-playing opportunities come out and they've succeeded, have really blossomed in that area. So I think knowing your players, I think keeping track of their sheets, their abilities. When I game, when I run a game, I will often use a checklist like I used to do in teaching. We were talking earlier about making sure everybody has an opportunity to shine, to be invested in the game. That's as simple as taking a checklist and putting check marks next to people when they become involved, right? When they do something. So that way you can see who's missing. I've also used initiative for no other reason than to make sure that players can get their point heard. So even though it may not be a combat encounter, I may say, okay, let's all roll initiative. Let's, put the initiative tree up. And then I will purposely go around the table and say, okay, what do you do? What do you do? Putting people on pause as they get involved. So, okay, now I'm going to cut scene and go to another place and, Karen, what do you do in this particular area? So that everybody is seen and heard at the table.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, to expand on what Ron said, Knowing the players is also knowing player types.
Yeah.
Over the years, there's been much written and talked about with player types. Go to any of the Dungeon Masters guides, up into including 5th edition, but go online and look up player types. So one of my favorite was a panel that Teos Abadia did for the Herald's Guild of DMs. You can find it on YouTube if you search Herald's Guild player types. He really breaks it down into different player types, not only what they are, how you can quickly recognize them, say if you're running at a convention, and how to engage them specifically, even if you have a mix of player types at the table. So here's an example. If you sit down at a table, ask each player, tell me 2 things about your character. So the first thing they usually do is give you their race and class. So that's why you ask for 2. The second thing they may give you a clue to where they're focused. So if you say, tell me 2 things, and one character says, I'm a half-orc barbarian, and I can do 50 points of damage even though I'm 3rd level because I have a magic weapon and I took this feat, you know you're probably talking to a power gamer. If instead they say, I'm a dwarf, and here's my tribe's battle song, and they sing it for you, now you probably have a role player. If you ask that question and someone gives you their response in character using a funny voice, you are probably talking to a thespian, right? Or if someone says, well, here's my character, and I have this special ability. Some DMs say I can't use it because of this, but some say I can because of this. You probably have a rules lawyer. So just with that one question, you might be able to pull out what kind of player you have. And if you know that, now you can start to use tools to engage this player in this way, this other player in this other way, and you're drawing everyone out to their own strengths or their own desires.
All right. So we do have some questions from the audience, so I don't want to ignore everybody. Let's see. So, okay, we'll go with the one that's a little more relevant to what we're talking about now, and then we'll pick up the other one. So, oh goodness, I'm going to have to, is that supposed to be Joker Jr.? I suppose that's supposed to be Joker Jr. Asks, I know this has probably been asked 1,000 times in 1,000 ways, but I'd like your takes. How do you handle everybody at the table wanting to roll a check following one player's failed roll?
Yeah. Honestly, I let it happen. You can go back and forth on whether or not people have the skill set, or there's some rules out there that say if you don't have proficiency in that particular area, you shouldn't be allowed to participate in the skill check. But for me, the game's about fun, and a lot of people get fun out of rolling dice, and they get very excited about it. And so usually what happens is one person says, I'll do X, and then everybody says, well, I'll try. Well, for me, that's okay, because at the end of the day, we talked at the beginning, it's not about whether I beat you, right? It's not competitive. It's about everybody having fun. So I allow it to happen. And then whatever happens in those dice rolls, remember the DM or the GM controls the DCs. No one knows what they are. You can set them in your mind. You can set them on the fly. You can still control a little bit, and that's not necessarily the word I want to use, but of the story and what's revealed by those rolls. Sometimes it's simple as, who rolled over a 19. And at the end of the day, for me, I want the players to be successful. I want them to wind up solving puzzles and riddles and excelling at the game. And if it means that more people roll to figure out something, I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Part of this is a design question as opposed to a DM question. And that design question is, why are you hiding whatever you're hiding behind a roll? If it's something that really doesn't need to be hidden, just allow it to happen with no roll needed. If it's something that the group can come together to figure out, make it a group check, where if half the PCs make the check, then they succeed. If half don't, they fail. You also have to think of what are the consequences for the group taking the extra time. And it all depends on what the check is. If it's a check where you're trying to track someone and you let the ranger who is proficient with survival make the roll, he or she fails. Now you can say, all right, you guys and gals can check it out, but you're going to be adding hours to this check. And what consequences does that make? Does it mean later in the encounter there are going to be more enemies because you've taken 4 extra hours to all do this search rather than just have one person do it?
Yeah, it's good.
So there are many different answers to that question, and it all depends on the type of check and the consequences of taking the extra time to make the check.
Awesome. All right, and then we can go to another question. Oh, goodness, you guys and your usernames. All right. Okay, Mech-Eins is the second half of it, so we'll go with that. What are your respective processes for sourcing the table and engaging your players from the start of the adventure that you're taking them on? So I think that also would lead us well into how do you handle getting people into the game and then keeping them focused when distractions happen.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about game one, I do a lot of stuff before the group even comes to the table, whether that's through email. I'll throw information out that way. Sometimes we'll do it, stories, and get the hooks out there so that they have a little bit of interest. As we grow together, and my group's been together for years, we usually talk to one another too, right? What do you want to do next? What do you find interesting? What source books, what scenarios, what time frame? Do you want to play Clockwork? Do you want to play Steampunk? Do you want forest based? So we have a lot of those conversations after the initial group meets. But as far as at the table, yeah, that's almost what we talked about earlier, right? You got to see where players their interest lies and make sure that you create a story that involves them all. So for me, it's just about, I guess, painting the scene. When I run Gothic horror, I use usually music and mood lighting. When I, do fantasy or forest based, we do jungle noises. So we do a lot of little things, but it's just, trying to at least put the teasers out there so you can see if they're interested or not.
Mm-hmm. And we have to recognize, I think, that there are many different types of games and many different types of situations and DMs. I'm sure Ron being a DM for a home group plus being a DM at conventions,
yeah,
that's 2 completely different situations.
Yep.
For a home group, you should definitely do a session 0 before the start of a campaign, right? You should set down some ground rules. You should know what all the players want. So really what you're sourcing the table by saying, hey, what do you want to play?
Right.
You may not have that luxury at a convention where you are running a published adventure in a 4-hour time slot. You can't say, hey, what do you want to play? But you can, as we've already talked about, ask some simple questions that elicit feedback that you can use. And always communicate in the clearest and quickest way possible. By asking people, does this make you uncomfortable? Or if there is a player who doesn't look like they're into a certain aspect, let them tell you what this NPC looks like. Give them different opportunities to contribute in ways that they might be more comfortable contributing in. And the last thing I want to talk about is quiet players, because a lot of times we as DMs, we see a quiet player and we want to fix the problem. And for some players, that's what they want. They want to be quiet. They want to watch the game more than they want to play the game. And even maybe an hour in, say, okay, let's take a 5-minute break, use the restroom, get a drink, and go to that player and say, you're not talking much and that's okay. Is there something that you would like us to do that will help you contribute? Or do you prefer just to watch? Because that's okay too. So that sort of communication, direct communication, is your most efficient way of sourcing a table.
Session 0 is really important, as we said about the home group, and I do session 0 sometimes in person and sometimes I do it outside of game. But that's the opportunity to even talk about what your expectations are as a DM. What's acceptable at the table. You set the tone there, as well as provide the environment and what we're going to do as well. But when I do homebrew rules, I will put them in a session 0. We'll talk about them. Sometimes you got to be flexible. As I said, this isn't about what you want. It's about everybody having fun. And there's often been times where we've used session 0 to work things out and to change things. We come across rules in the game that, a good GM is able to adjust on the fly and get the game moving. But sometimes we use out of session to even discuss those, right? Mm-hmm. What did you think about this? Because ultimately, you get power gamers at the table, but you get a lot of different personalities and everybody just wants to have fun. So session 0 is real important. But, as I said, you can do that in person or you can do that out of person. That depends on you.
Yeah, for those out there who might not know what session 0 means, it basically means before you even start rolling up characters or playing, sit down and talk about what everyone wants out of the campaign or out of the sessions. And so that's when you, as Ron just said, you all come together, have a meeting of the minds, and make up a social contract, essentially, on what this campaign is going to be. Are there particular rules that we don't want to use because they don't fit in the steampunk campaign that we want? Or do we want a low magic campaign? Or do we want to play all fighters and so magic is going to be very weak in this campaign? Those are the sorts of things, but also social things like, all right, we're going to meet this many times and at this time, and who's going to provide the food, and all those sorts of social things that make the game what it is.
Our rule is last person in the building orders the pizza.
There you go.
That's usually the rule, and everybody just waits. So you get people to arrive early.
Yeah, that's a good. I like that one. I'm writing that down.
Yeah, Shawn, it's like you took the question out of my head. I was going to have one of you describe session 0. So thank you for that.
No problem.
All right. Yeah, usernames are easier to read now. So we have Dozy Clown. Is asking, how do you keep from getting overwhelmed DMing 5e with the sheer number of abilities and rules that players have, especially after 4th or 5th level?
Good question. I don't. I get overwhelmed. I'll be honest and transparent. Although I've done this for a very long time, I get a lot of angst and anxiety about making the game perfect. And it is a simple statement that my gamers always say to me, right? And I've read, if your players have fun, you've done a good job. But as far as managing it, I worry about where the campaign's heading, and some of the encounters. My players are better rules guys than I am, right? I mean, I've read the book 100,000 times, but they're at the table. I usually rely on the players to know their own abilities, the players to know what they can and cannot do. I'm more involved when it becomes a question of a situation or whether something can happen at that particular moment in time. I look over character sheets because I like to be familiar with what's going on, right? But, such things as, and I'm thinking of Spiritual Hammer, right? So that one comes in a lot as far as the players and what they can do with it. And we've had long discussions about that. But overall, I release a lot of that stress with rules by letting the players play their characters. And then if something happens that we need to talk about, I usually do that later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on the group that you have. But I totally agree with what Ron said. If you're a DM, and if you DM a lot, there's a lot of player-facing rules that you are just not going to know.
Yeah. And
it's okay to slow down, and if a player does something, say, what does that spell do? Could you explain it to me? Let them be the teacher. And after the 100th time they explain it to you,
yeah, you got it.
if you're me, then you are beginning to start to understand.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of stuff, but there's been a lot of stuff in every edition, right? 4th edition, 3rd edition, even the earliest editions had a lot of crunch to try to remember. And I am not one of those people that can memorize the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. But if you drop on the strengths of your table let the rules lawyer, let that be his or her avenue into the game. Let them describe what just happened to even the players that don't know their own character that well.
Yeah.
And everyone can have their fun that way.
Yeah, one of my biggest flaws as a DM, and you should have seen it by using spiritual hammer instead of spiritual weapon, is I have 7 editions in my head that I've GM'd in every single edition. And so for me, and some of those blend, right? So, purposely, sometimes I bring over older rules. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes we do it on the fly. So it is having a guy at the table. But in general, if it's quick, they can open the book while I'm still narrating to check out a rule. I mean, we've had that too, right? I don't know what the spell does, but somebody pass them the player's handbook. I'll keep talking about it. We'll go around an initiative, and we've worked together on that. So it's tough, but it's not impossible. And I think if you stop worrying that you're the only person who can do this, it's a lot easier. It's like, when I used to say in teaching, we used to, as history teachers, we used to think that in order for things to be learned, we had to speak them into existence. The reality is facilitating is also teaching, right? So in a gaming situation, you're facilitating having fun. And I think that you can give a lot of those responsibilities to other people at the table so that you're not overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. I cannot stop saying reflex save instead of dexterity save. I still constantly, could you make a reflex save? And reflex is 2 syllables and dexterity is more. So reflex just rolls off the tongue better. Yeah. So I think officially they should change it just for dexterity to a reflex saving throw.
Here.
Yeah, I have a DM who still says spot checks occasionally. So
right. Oh yeah,
that's a fun one. Yep. Right. So we have another question from Spearmint Fur. Any advice on running pre-published adventures?
Sure. Now, I probably do this more than not. We talked about being overwhelmed earlier. I would love to be in the position where I can create my own world, populate it, write my own stories and scenarios. But the reality is sometimes that's tough. So I've run a lot of pre-published adventures. Read them cover to cover is my first advice. Make sure you understand where you're going, not just where you are. And then once you've read it once, twice, 3 times, whatever it takes, just being ahead of the players, recognize the problem with any pre-published is they can go in any direction that the players want to go. And I don't believe in railroading. So all of your prep may be thrown out the window anyway. But I guess the best advice I could say is try to know at least direction and outcomes so that you can plan accordingly, right? So you know where the adventure is supposed to go. Sometimes I'll use just note cards, and I'll purposely only write 1 or 2 things on them so that I don't railroad the players. So, here are the 4 major plot concepts that I want to get to, and allow them to do that. But, reading is certainly the first piece, right? Make sure you read the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. This question hits me right where I live, because growing up as a DM, I only ran stuff that I created myself. When I got involved as a freelancer, I was always writing for organized play, which is you want to run the adventure as close to the text as you can, because you're running part 1 of an adventure and they may have a different DM for part 2. Yeah. And that DM doesn't have any idea what you as DM 1 did. So there's this interplay between that. Now, even as an organized play author, I beg of you, please make the adventure fit the party that you're running. There is no way that I, as the author of a published adventure, know the specific situation you as the DM is in. So I need you to make me better. I need you to save me from my own ignorance as the author. Because I'm not writing for your group. I'm writing for the world. You have to rewrite what I wrote for your group. Even in organized play, as much as you can, tailor the content to what it is. Now, as the DM, I have now been running organized play for 20 years. I have that muscle in my brain has atrophied that lets me just kind of make things up as I go. I am now, since we're locked in the house, running a campaign for my daughter and my wife. And I am using Dragon of Icespire Peak. And so they'll ask a question, and I instantly find myself spending 5 minutes scanning the text, looking for the answer. And I realize I don't need to do this. I can just make up an answer and then change what's coming. And so that's important to remember, is that the published adventure is a guide, and you need to be the captain of the ship to sail where your players and you need to go.
Awesome. All right. We did have another question from, it looks like, Alan Childers. Going back to the social contract you guys were talking about earlier with session 0, this person's asking, is the social contract flexible if the players, given if the player's feeling where the story's going? So I'm guessing that, is that flexible if the story changes? Can the social contract change as the story changes?
It depends on what we mean by the social contract. If we're talking style of play, if we're talking environment, if we're talking whether it's high magic or low magic, all of those certainly are, depending on what happens. But if we're talking social contract at what is acceptable at the table, such as not offending other players, not talking about, whether we talk about sexuality or violence, depending on what that social contract was, then that's not negotiable, right? If it's going to hurt somebody, then it's not. But if we're talking game, for me, somewhat. If you've created a world together that doesn't have science fiction in it, sometimes that's tough, but not impossible. Right? I mean, you can go that direction, but I also like to make sure that everybody is, interested in what we're doing, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, if you're playing a high fantasy game and you set that tone from the beginning and everyone understands that, and all of a sudden they step through a portal and they're in the Wild West,
right,
with 6-shooters and stagecoaches, that's something that should be in the social contract to start with. Now, if you're trying to make it a surprise, you don't have to ruin the surprise. You can say, is it all right with everyone if we start with high fantasy, but we may end up going somewhere else? Is that okay? That keeps that shock, that surprise, that delight in the change of genre without completely stepping on everyone's expectations.
I'm looking at the second part of that question too, just about the DM, whether he narrates or.
Oh, that was a seപ്പെate person's question, but yes, we can go to that one next. Yes.
All right. Well, I mean, that's matter of style. There are DMs that are more comfortable in narrating, what the Duke says rather than being the Duke. I tend to do both. I tend to, at times, become the person, especially if there is negotiation involved or diplomacy, right? And so you ask a player, hey, well, what do you say? Rather than just the die roll, right? Well, how are you going to intimidate? How are you going to investigate? Whatever it is. How are you going to persuade? And that becomes a living conversation sometimes. But there are other times where I just say, okay, you walk in and then Duke says, and I don't put voice in it, and I don't put personality in it. It depends on the situation. I do both, but I'm not a great method actor, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the question is essentially, what's the difference for the players between a DM who does a first person sort of acting role play versus a third person description role play? And I mean, the difference is whatever the players want, right? If the players want this first person interaction where they're in character and you're in character, then that's what you should do. And there are definitely better actors than I, than a lot of DMs. But there are a few tricks you can do to give a little bit of that, and even if it's just slowing down the cadence of your voice.
True.
When you're DMing, you might be talking in this way, but when you go into a character, you slow down, or you speed up because you're playing a halfling who talks really fast. I mean, just those little things can give the idea of what an NPC is like without, having to cosplay and take voice acting lessons for 5 years.
Yeah, on that same vein, I've actually heard there was one DM I know who had fake coins, right? Like and he would keep it in a small bag, like a dice bag. And when he role played a certain character, his voice never changed, but he would sit there and mess with those coins.
Mm-hmm.
So that the players hear that kind of clink every time. So that anytime he would make that clinking noise, they immediately knew what NPC they were talking to. Yeah. So there's other cues like that. You don't always have to change your voice. There could be some prop or something you could use as well.
Right. A very simple thing to do is go online and say, all right, my NPC is a middle-aged human man, bald. So go to Google images, print out a human male bald, hold it up while you are in that character. You don't have to change your voice. You don't have to do anything. Here is who I am now. Oh, they're going to talk to the elven princess. All right, here we go. Here's the elven princess. This is who I am now. Something as simple as that can make a lot of difference to players.
Yeah, and for me, sometimes my body posture and motion changes, so I'll often fold my hands, or I'll get animated and I'll stand up. Like, you can, even without being able to voice act well, my persona changes noticeably. That it might sound like the same person they've run into 4 times, right, but they know that now that person, I am now in character. So I use hand motions and facial tics every once in a while.
Yeah. And if you're DMing, say you're DMing at a convention and you're going to be running 3 or 4 games in a day, changing your voice can really damage it. So be careful with doing that, especially if you don't talk a lot regularly and then go into a situation where you're talking for 12 hours straight and really straining your vocal cords. Be careful with that.
Definitely. Yeah. It is so easy to wear your voice out and things like that.
Yep.
So we were talking earlier about dice rolls and kind of letting players help drive the narrative and everything. But when are times where you should say no? Like, what is because everyone knows that, say yes to the players, let them do what they want, adapt to what they do. But I'd like to discuss the importance of saying no. Like, when is it important to say no? Is it okay to say no? And things like that.
Yeah. So yes is the answer to the question. For the most part, I guess my no can be categorized as I never say no to a player who wants to do something innovative and interesting. You control the outcome. So even if a player says something that's bizarre and off the wall, they can still do it. I usually, they'll probably, if they're watching, and I doubt they are, I usually say, well, you can try, right? I mean, you can do whatever you want. As far as no, for me, the laws of physics are so off that it's not possible to do it, right? I'm going to pick up a building. Okay, you're not. And again, same issue, right? You can try. Go ahead and go have your character go over there and see if they can lift the building. My no's are either that or it breaks the world. So we talked about being in a steampunk setting or being in a sci-fi setting, and I'm going to fly. Okay, so how are you going to fly exactly, right? I mean, I know that's another physics question, but if you wanted low magic and somebody says they're going to, perform magic that's not even on their character sheet, I mean, there are things that come up that are no's. My other no is if it's absolutely the wrong application of the rule. Sometimes when they're moving miniatures around, they do things they're not allowed to do, whether it's, take an extra step or call a flanking rule into place that's actually not flanking. I mean, those no's come out pretty easy because they're in the game, right? Or whichever rules that we're using at the time. And my other no's are, we talked about, at least my what I said about a social contract of things we will and won't do at the table. If my players are uncomfortable in a particular area, or if they're uncomfortable with where a conversation's going, that's an absolute no. And that's we talked all the way back at the beginning. The GM's job or DM's job is to make sure those things don't happen. So you need to be able to read the room. But those are my 3 no's, right? Physics, I guess. Changing the setting, and if it's a obvious flaw or application of a rule, that's not allowed to happen at game time. Everything else for me is yes. Right? You can try, you can do whatever you want, roll. And in my mind, and you may be worried about the outcome, but remember, you have that story in your head. So even if the 20 is rolled, now is another opportunity to advance a storyline in whichever way that person wanted, right? There was a situation where there was an ancient lore, which was Cthulhu in nature, and there was no way I was letting the players have that information, because it was something that they couldn't wrap their minds around. Well, lo and behold, that's when the 20 seems to roll itself, right? And so now, you've allowed the player to roll the number. Now you have to be able to adjust on the fly. So, but you still control what information you give. So even within that, I just gave him snippets. I told him you were able to understand a couple different words, right? And now you've planted hooks. So in the game, when it's creative and innovating, I never say no, right? A jump off, grab the chandelier, try to jump on his back. Okay, go ahead, roll. But there are certain no's they're easy, and those are the ones I kind of talked about.
Yeah, I mean, Ron covered pretty much everything I was going to say. In terms of the social contract, the session 0 is the no, right? That's when everyone gets a chance to say no without any hard feelings. And if there are hard feelings, then you're playing with the wrong group. So get those no's out of the way as soon as possible. For something like organized play, for the Adventurers League, the campaign guide is the yes and the no. These are the rules we use. These are the rules we don't use. This is how we expect the campaign to run. It's all right there. One thing about saying yes and no, though, is, we've talked about the DM as being a facilitator of other people's experiences. But I think a game's fun is like what they say about love, right? You can't truly love someone unless you love yourself first. You can't truly have fun in a role-playing game as the GM unless you are having fun yourself. Yeah. So you have to be clear when everyone expects you to say yes, but saying yes would curtail your fun. That's when you need to say no, and here's why. Here's why this is going to ruin my fun, and communicate that outside of the game and get everyone on the same page. But in game, in terms of yes and no, as Ron summed it up perfectly. All I was going to add was yes, but let's think through the consequences, right? And sometimes you have to step out of character and say, all right, you want to do this. You can do this. But let's, as a group that's going to tell a story, figure out what those consequences are going to be for this thing that you're about to do. Do we agree that if you succeed at this, these might be the repercussions? If you're all okay with that, me as the story facilitator see it as going in this direction. Is everyone okay with that? Good. Roll that 20-sided die. Let's see what happens.
Awesome. All right. Don't think we had any other major questions from the audience, so I'll go back to mine. Both of you have kids and have run games for younger audiences before. Do you have any tips and tricks that you can give people? Because running for a younger audience can be a lot different than running for adults. I mean, not only are there going to be some social contract things that just don't bring up certain things, but just how do you run things at a table? Because younger players can often be the most enthusiastic players you'll ever have, and then sometimes the most distracted players you'll ever have.
Shawn, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I'll start. So I want to say first that unless the players are really young, like preteen and younger, I've found that many are the same as older players. They have the same player types. They have the same distractions as older ones. In fact, I've tried to talk sometimes with parents about gaming with the younger players, and I'll get angry comments from parents like, well, my child's 5 years old and she's already memorized the player's handbook and she's DM'd a campaign worthy of Greyhawk for the last 3 years. So how dare you tell me how? I'm just talking in general. You have a super genius. Great. Good. Get them started on their first campaign world. But if we're talking about relatively normal children and of the younger ages, I think imaginative play should be stressed over mathematical or mechanical play. Do more imagining a scene than following some sort of strict set of rules. Because if you start trying to explain an action economy to a 6-year-old, you're probably going to be in trouble. Not that they can't handle it, but that's not where their brain wants to be. So instead, start doing things with imagining scenes. Oh, you are a ranger and you have an animal friend. Who's your animal friend? Could you describe your animal friend? What does your animal friend eat? Could you draw a picture of your animal friend? Those sorts of things move in the direction of the game without going through all the mechanical things. However, dice are great toys and they're great at teaching math. So if you have a child who's in that range where they're starting to learn addition, multiplication, subtraction, take a D6, take a D4, roll them and add them together, right? Those are great tools for teaching. In terms of your sessions, shorter is much, much, much better than longer. It's better to leave them wanting more than to try to push through something they're not interested in, because that will immediately turn them off to this incredible game. Those are the things that I've found most for very young players.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo all of that. It depends on the age that we're talking about, and it depends on the level of competency in the game. I mean, are we talking brand new players? Are we talking players who have been playing for a while? I mean, all that matters too. But I loved when you play with younger children. I think it's important to allow them, as you said, to be creative and innovative and be okay with that. Be okay with the bizarre things that they come up with, because that's the level of engagement that's really going to keep them involved in the game. And you can create a story with them. I mean, if they decide they want to, find a unicorn with, the multicolored horn and do whatever they want to do and go with it. Descriptions more than anything. I would actually say simplify rules, right? One the best things about Fifth is it allows you to do a lot on the fly of just roll a D20 or advantage and disadvantage, and you can run a whole game with just 3 or 4 mechanics. Streamline that for them, streamline character sheets, have them create their own character sheets with art, with a couple different numbers that they need to. But as Shawn said, if we're talking about teaching and you want to teach numbers, don't also assume that children can't, right? Shawn's first statement, they're not any different. Think about many of us, right? I got hooked at the game at 12, and the reason I was hooked was the math, the actual rules, right? I had that book memorized cover to cover. I to this day, I still can remember that a dwarf's constitution bonus for poisons was based on every 3.5 points on that he had in the attribute. That was what I wanted. So just because they're young, don't think they can't take rules, and that they don't understand mechanics. They absolutely may be better at some of those areas, but I would just focus on descriptions and being willing to let the story go wherever it goes.
All right. And we do have another question here from Orzi Zarius. How much do you as DMs fudge or improv or not to avoid PC deaths?
Yeah. The age-old question, right?
Right.
I am a firm believer in fudging die rolls, and here's why. So I will roll out in public when I want them to know that I'm not fudging dies, right? So in a major battle, I may pull the die out and go, okay, here, whatever happens, right, and I'll throw it. But for the most part, I've learned over time. So let's talk about TPKs and let's talk about player death. Since I started with first edition, I'm not afraid of death. As a matter of fact, it was part of a badge of honor when you had your characters die 14, 15 times until you finally beat it, right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with death. But that being said, the longer you go into a campaign, the more vested people become in the campaign and the more vested they become in their characters. So I will fudge die rolls when I think that a death is going to happen and I don't want it to, right? When players make stupid decisions, and there are some, right, that just shouldn't do what they're about to do, all bets are off. Mm-hmm. But if there's a situation where they're really trying hard and they're playing and everyone's invested and involved in the process, and here's the big baddie, and my crit may kill, I might not. Now, for the most part, to be honest, going down to 0 is not death. So if you have a party of 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 people and someone goes down, well, I know that the clerics are going to heal them. I know that someone's going to, to tend to them, spare the dying. I know it's going to happen, and I'm not as concerned about it at that point. But if we are 7, 8, 9, 10 a year into the adventure and we're not at the climax or the final piece of this adventure, I may. It all depends on the situation, but I certainly do it, and I think you have to. I mean, that's just me. If it's first level, I'm not worried about it. I've had first level TPKs and we've moved on from it. But later, you're facing Strahd, and I'm not ready for the TPK because there's a bigger story at hand. Sometimes I might.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say I fudge all the time, and then I started thinking about it. I'm like, well, probably half the play I do is playtesting. And so you don't want to fudge playtesting because you want to see how difficult it actually is. So it comes back to social contract, right? It comes back to that session 0. Talk to your players. Do you want me to fudge? Yeah. Do you want me to make things easier if you're having a hard time, or make it harder if you're having too easy a time? Do you want that? In terms of organized play, depends on the party that I'm playing with. If I have a bunch of new players new to the game, yes, I am going to fudge. I am going to do whatever is in my power to make that experience as memorable as possible for them. If I have a group of 18th level power gamers who just want it all brought at them, then I will still fudge, just in the other direction. I will make it so that they remember that they had this game.
And I've done the same. It fudges both ways. There's times I've had bosses that went down that did not go down yet because I felt that the encounter needed to go longer. If you are concerned about those, what a TPK, for example, I keep your players' hit points so that you know where they're at. So when you deliver a blow, you don't deliver 20 points when they have 15 left. Right? You can fudge those numbers as well. So if I know a player has 7 hit points left, I can still hit him and not kill him. So that'll be done. I often feel bad about my 20s. So even though I roll behind the screen, I will often show the 20 because it's going to hurt when it happens. And sometimes I wonder if players think, oh, he didn't roll a 20. And I go, oh, sorry, guys, here it is. So it fudges both ways. Absolutely. Yep. It's about the story. I mean, but as Shawn said at the end, if you have power gamers who, want to know that they really won this battle, okay. But I'm more concerned about the story than anything else.
Right.
Now, that being said, they roll what they roll, so I control the DCs. That's pretty easy on that side of the screen.
Yep.
Okay. And our time's almost up. So since we're on this topic, have there ever been times where there has been a TPK and then you turned it into part of the story? Or has every TPK been a retcon or a whole new story?
Both. It depends. Again, depends on the situation. Depends on where, what's happening in the storyline. If it's first level, it's usually a TPK, and then we start over. And part of the fun of that is, as I said, I'm not afraid of death. Right? Everyone here knows if we go into the Tomb of Horrors, that the whole goal is to survive. When you battle Strahd, right, he wipes out most parties. Like, there's part of that if you always retcon those, and it becomes anticlimactic, right? I want to know that I won in the Tomb of Horrors. I want to know that in my battle against Strahd, I made him. Strahd doesn't die, but I made him go, right? I made him run away. I made him, at least we beat him that encounter. But I've done both. I've done I don't necessarily like the dream sequence, but I've done it, especially with, involving Aislinn. Something else happens. Somebody else comes into the mix. You should have been dead, but you're not. So why? I've done those. I guess, again, it depends on where you are in that adventure. Sometimes we're at the point where everybody's done, right? The climax of TPKing is exactly what it should have been, and there's no need to do it. And then other times it becomes an evolving story, and you can move it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had an accidental TPK doing the D&D Next playtest. They were first level characters, and they found a scroll. And during the rule set that was in play at the time, if you miscast the spell, this random thing happened. So it just so happened that this party found the scroll, decided to try to use it. There was a mishap, and they ended up being plane shifted. And so there weren't even rules for the planes out yet, but I've been playing forever. So I was like, okay, let's random number 1 to 16. What plane do you end up on? Oh, you ended up in the 9 hells at first level. Shall we say that you're done and we should start over? And the answer was yes. So that was the accidental TPK. I just ended the Tomb of Annihilation campaign with almost a TPK, right? It could have been a TPK, but Acererak decided to leave one character alive and make him drag all of the other dead bodies out of the tomb as some sort of walk of shame. And so it didn't end with a TPK, but it may as well have been. But now, if we continue that story with those characters, because they could be brought back from the dead, but the one character that was left alive was actually sent off for a while, for like 20 minutes. What did Acererak do to the bodies of his dead companions before he came back and was told to remove them? Right. So there's some great story that you could tell based on that. But it all depends on what your players want. And give them a couple of days, because sometimes if you have a TPK, the players get super upset and they're like, no, we don't want to play these characters ever again. And let them think about it. Maybe come back and say, hey, if you want to continue these characters, I've got a cool story that we could tell. And maybe at that point they'll be like, oh, this might be cool. Maybe you tell them a little bit about the story that you want to tell and then continue from there. But sometimes tempers might get a little hot. So, give it some time.
There is one time I'm very careful about TPKs, and that's with kids. Depending on the age level, again, you need to know them. But there's a lot of times that even at cons, so conventions are the one place where TPK is part of it, right? You're there for a couple hours, but I'm very careful with kids, just because it's a different experience when your player dies. So that's one of the areas I pay attention to.
That's definitely a good point. All right, well, that was our last question. So was there anything that either one of you are doing soon that you'd like to promote real quick before we say goodbye to everyone?
I just wanted to say that, thank you all for listening out there. If you enjoy talking about D&D, I have a podcast called Down with D&D. You can find it at misdirectedmark.com or on, wherever you get your podcasts. So if you want to give it a listen, we talk a lot about things like this.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm good. If you want to follow me, I'm out there. I'm on Facebook, Ronald Korn. I'm also Twitter at DM Strad. So either way, but thanks for being here. Thanks for listening.
Yes, and thank you all, and thank you, GaryCon, for hosting this.
Yes.
This is great, right?
Yes.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.